Good evening, comrades. Welcome to the fifth session in our series of ABC of Marxism. Today we're focusing on the question of exploitation and the decline of capital. And Ian Spencer, our regular speaker, will be discussing issues around capitalist crisis, the coming into being of the working class, and the organizational form. So looking forward to this session. Thank you, Ian.
Good evening, comrades. The whole area of the decline of capital and capitalist crisis deserves a whole special session or even series on its own. But I just want to mention something important as part of that, and of course it follows on logically from what we were talking about the last time we met. So have a look at what we mean by exploitation when we think about the exploitation of the working class, and the idea of that class coming into being for itself, as opposed to being merely a nascent class, merely a potential class, a class which is yet to achieve that sort of collectivity and realize its historical mission to transform capitalism into a society without classes at all. So drawing on prior Marx's whole work was the critique of political economy. He wasn't putting forward a kind of alternative political economy so much as exposing the faults in classical political economy, and in so doing providing a scientific base for looking at the transformation of capitalism to socialism. And as part of that, he was particularly interested in, for example, the impact of machinery on capital development, and what that meant for ultimately the decline of capitalism. Given that Marx has the labor theory of value at its very heart, one could argue that any kind of a success in refuting the labor theory of value would bring the whole Marxist project to the ground. And so therefore it's of crucial importance. So whereas in the past I've always tried to kind of integrate political economy and politics and philosophy, whilst I'm still trying to do that, I have to focus a little bit on the political economy today, because it will show us how that then led into the importance of the International Working Men's Association, the First International, and the period of revolutionary struggle that followed. So just to recap briefly on the question of surplus value. I mentioned about how exploitation is an objective relationship from the point of view of Marx. So you don't have to feel exploited to be exploited. Here we have, as I've mentioned before, if we imagine the line ABC to be an 8-hour day, and in the first 4 hours you make enough commodities to be equal to the value of your labor power, and that provides your wage, as it were, but you're still obliged to work for another 4 hours because you've sold your labor power for 8 hours, not 4. So you work on, and that additional 4 hours is surplus labor time, and the origin therefore of surplus value, because the commodities that are then sold are the realization of surplus value. Why it's important to mention that is because the surplus value isn't the same as profit for Marx, and again, that might sound pedantic, but it's crucial, because not only is it at the heart of the way in which relations of production are obscured under capitalism, but it's also a way in which Marx can show that there is a tendency on the rate of profit to fall as a result of the adoption of new technologies. And it goes to show that crisis and ultimately decline is an intrinsic feature of capitalism. It's not something that can be dealt with or handled, for example, as we see, for example, in Keynesian economics, for example, where the idea is that through judicious government policy, you can simply take the rough edges off capitalism and it can just last forever. For Marx, that's unthinkable. The inherent tendency for capitalism is towards its decline and ultimate demise. And not only, as we've seen, bring in to being the proletariat as its gravedigger, but ultimately show the mechanism by which it will be superseded. As I mentioned before, the rate of surplus value can be increased by simply extending the working day. So instead of an 8-hour day, you're forced to work a 10-hour day. And it's not surprising, therefore, that struggles over the length of the working day have been crucially important in labour struggles over the decades. And also, of course, another thing that can happen is that the amount of time it takes to produce the goods which workers need to consume can be reduced, for example, by the development of new technology, the improvement of land, and so on. And what you can then get is a situation where there is a rising rate of exploitation and a rising rate of profit. So simultaneously, both workers and capitalists seem to be doing better. Now, does that mean that there is a kind of possibility of some sort of happy medium? Well, the point is, for Marx, no. And I just want to draw this distinction then between surplus value and profit. If anybody immediately has a cold shiver going down their spine at the thought of algebra or something like that, this is being brought to you by a man who has to still take his shoes and socks off to count beyond 10. And therefore, what you'll see is that it's fairly straightforward. I couldn't help but include this picture, by the way. I didn't realize that there is this gangmasters and labour abuse authority. And this is an actual poster from them. Labour exploitation is a crime, apparently. Whereas, of course, for Marx, labour exploitation isn't a crime. In fact, all products, as it were, are exchanging at their values. Workers get paid usually at the value of their labour power. And there is a kind of, in a sense, an equal exchange. There's no, there isn't a breach in the bourgeois law of the exchange of equivalence. If you enter into the labour contract, you are entering into a real contract. The fact that you don't have a choice not to enter into that contract is, of course, something which is unique to the labour contract. But for the moment, Marx's point is that it's not just about the working class being robbed. It's about this being an intrinsic part of capitalist relations of production. So just to introduce these terms, so constant capital, for example, is the capital which is expended, for example, on means of production, whether that's machinery, whether that's raw materials, whether that's the purchase of land to be worked on, or whatever else, or a place for a factory. Constant capital is that part which is spent on means of production, and the importance of that is that it's constant because it doesn't create new value. It passes on its value in tiny parts. So if you can imagine a kind of idealized version, if you have a machine making plastic bottles and each machine makes exactly 1 million plastic bottles and then collapses, it passes on 1/1,000,000th part of its value to each plastic bottle, but it adds no new value. Variable capital, by contrast, is the capital which is advanced against the employment of workers. So the employment of workers and the purchase of their labour power, their capacity to labour, which commodity which once used yields labour and is unique in that labour yields more value than the cost of reproducing labour power. And that's the distinction. So variable capital is that part of capital which is advanced for the purchase of labour power. Surplus value, we've already mentioned, is that part of the commodity after the sale of the commodities, which are the product of surplus labour time. So we have then some little equations. Don't worry about those too much, but we see a rate of surplus value. We can express that in that form, S over V, and we can express a rate of profit as well. which is different from surplus value. So it's S over C plus V. So it's surplus value divided by constant capital plus variable capital. So the capital that's being advanced for both means production and wages divided, the surplus value is divided by that. And then we have this weird and wonderful term. So let me just need to go back one. Sorry. There we go. And this jargony sounding term, the organic composition of capital, is about this relationship between constant capital, the bit that's spent on machinery, and variable capital. This relationship between the money that's spent on the capital that's spent on constant capital, machinery and means of production, and variable capital spent on the purchase of labor power. Now, why that's important, we'll see here. What Marx is arguing is that one of the bases for the decline of capital rests in the rising organic composition of capital. So in other words, because only labor really creates new value, and because machinery only imparts a small part of itself to the finished product, it doesn't add any new value. It simply imparts a little piece of its value to the commodity. But the tendency is on the part of capitalists to naturally want to replace living labor with dead labor. And the whole history of capital accumulation since the Industrial Revolution particularly has seen the replacement of workers with machines wherever possible. The development from a simple division of labor to a detailed division of labor. Again, all of this goes back to classical political economy. If you think about Adam Smith and his discussion of the pin manufactory, for example, he talks about the way in which if you've got a worker whose job it is making pins, and that's all he does, he makes pins all day, he can only make a few hundred a day if he's very skilled. And that's just a kind of natural division of labor, a simple division of labor. If you get a detailed division of labor where one worker draws out the wire, another one cuts the wire, another one sharpens the pin, another one puts the head on, and so on and so forth, you move from making a few hundred a day to tens of thousands a day. And that detailed division of labor is a particular feature of capitalism. So the point is that as it is only human labor that adds new value, the replacement of human labor with dead labor, with past labor, with machinery, effectively leads to a tendency on the part of the rate of profit to fall. Now, the question is this an empirical question? Can we look at it and say the rate of profit has been falling? Well, how do we reconcile that with the fact that people's lives have generally got better? We can think about, and so what tends to happen is that the discussion tends to go off into flights of fancy around, well, provide the statistics which show that this is happening. Well, actually, that can be done, but that isn't what Marx is getting at. The aim here is to show how this is a tendential law. So it's a tendency in that general direction. As we'll go on to see, there are lots of countervailing tendencies, which mean that, profits don't fall through the floor just because a new machinery is added. And if that were the case, then why is it that if it's only human labor that adds new value, well, why is it then that you can have some kinds of production, such as the North Sea oil industry, for example? A North Sea oil rig doesn't employ that many people. It has a lot of capital invested, a lot of investment in constant capital, the rigs, the ships to bring the oil in and all the rest of it, but not many actual workers on there. So why is it that makes vast profits? By contrast, the building industry, which is very labor intensive, might not make very good profits at all, or only marginal profits, or reasonable profits, but not as much as the oil industry. if you cast your mind back to when we were talking about the labour theory of value, there was a similar dilemma there. If it's only the amount of labour embodied in a thing that creates its value, then surely that means a really rubbish worker, it takes him 10 hours to make a table. That table is more valuable than a skilled worker who can knock one up in about 4 hours. The point for Marx is that this is a social product, and what he's arguing is not the amount of labour embodied by an individual worker. It's an aliquot part of socially necessary labour time. So it is, as it were, if all the labours of society are kind of evened out over the course of production. Some are more efficient, some are less efficient, but it's a social product rather than just being the product of individuals. And the same goes for capital. That some capitals are capital intensive and profitable, some are capital intensive and not so profitable, and similarly some are labor intensive and profitable and vice versa. But over the whole piece, over the whole economy, they balance one another out. They even one another out. So what you have then is social labor, abstract labor, in antagonism with social capital, evened out over the course of the whole of production. So only labor adds new value, and we're not here talking about. We're talking here about the production of commodities. So there are whole areas which arguably produce no new value, but suck in value from elsewhere. Banking, for example, is a good example. So a bank lends money and receives more money back. So we have a capital being advanced and a profit being made, but without that production process in the middle, or rather the production process is taking place elsewhere. And from that point of view, banking, for example, is a parasitic form of capital. So past labour, embodied in means of production, is merely transferring itself to the product. Capitalist competition forces the introduction of new technology. If you've all of a sudden got a way of producing watches or fridges or mobile phones or whatever else, instead of them being made in one way, can now be made much more readily by the replacement of workers, then what you get is a scenario that's presented here with these two examples. In volume 3 of Capital, where this is discussed more fully, on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, Marx has more examples. I've simplified it. So here, for example, we have an enterprise with sort of 20 units, as it were, of constant capital, 80 of variable capital, the money spent on workers' wages, and a surplus of 80. So here we are. Our rate of surplus value is 100%. And there's another one which also has 100% rate of surplus value, but the constant capital is much higher. The amount spent on machinery is much higher. The amount spent on wages, workers, the purchase of labour power is much lower. But you still have, because of this relationship between surplus value and variable capital, the same rate of surplus value, but quite a different level of profit. Excuse me, sorry about that. There we go. So quite a different level of profit. So here, for example, is our organic composition of capital. Here, it's a quarter. So the relationship between constant and variable capital, 20 is a quarter of 80. Here, we see that the relationship between constant and variable capital, 80 is four times the variable capital. So you see quite a different organic composition of capital. And what you get, paradoxically, is a lower rate of profit. Now, obviously, that's greatly simplified. Marx goes into it in far more detail. And there are a lot of, you'll imagine, there's been a great deal of discussion around how this comes about, how it happens on a social basis. But the important thing here is that the capitalist has no choice. The capitalist doesn't have a choice to simply say, well, this will cause the overall rate of profit to fall. Competition, ironically, isn't just about capitalists fighting it out as antagonists of one another. It also binds them together in their common class interests. The capitalist who decides not to bother with scientific innovation, not to bother with new machinery, very quickly loses out to other capitalists who have spent the money on new machinery, who have replaced living labor with dead labor. And so therefore, you tend to see the capitalist has no choice whatsoever, or else they cease being a capitalist. And from that point of view, the competition, ironically, binds them together in antagonism to labor. They don't really need to have the Adam Smith Society or whatever else to go to, or to go to city livery companies to recognize their common interest as capitalists. They're bound together by their need to compete with one another in order to make the system work at all. So what Marx is putting forward then is a tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And arguably, this has been also an empirical feature. There are lots of debates around that. And of course, when it's discussed in Volume 3 of Capital, there's a lot more detail as to how the various countervailing tendencies work with regard to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. This graph I've lifted shamelessly from Michael Roberts, who has a very good kind of Marxist blog simply called The Next Recession, and it's on WordPress. If anybody fancies looking at it a bit further. And Michael Roberts presents it in a very kind of accessible style. And here he has taken data from the Office for National Statistics and from another researcher by the name of Mato, and has shown that there are two kind of separate researchers who have come up with more or less the same kind of pattern of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall in the context of the UK economy between 1855 and 2009. So what are those countervailing tendencies? Why is it that we have a situation where, on the one hand, there's a tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and yet actually we're all quite a lot better off than we were in 1855? Well, one is, for example, the increased tendency to exploitation that can offset it. So here we're not necessarily talking just about extending the working day. You can also talk about the way in which the goods that the workers buy in order to reproduce themselves on a daily basis become cheaper and cheaper. So actually you can have an increasing intensity of exploitation without necessarily feeling as though you're being exploited more, just on the basis that the things that you need to buy themselves become cheapened by the introduction of new technology. Under certain circumstances, wages can be depressed below the value of labor, below the value of labor power. So, and that can refer to workers being put in such a wretched condition that they're put in a position of working for sheer subsistence, as we see in large parts of the world. But it can also be relative to the particular development of a particular society. So if, for example, what would be regarded as part of the normal reproduction of a worker's wage in Britain, there are plenty of workers who don't earn anywhere near that, who are subsisting. Yes, they've got enough to eat. Yes, they've got a roof over their heads, but they're nowhere near in a position to enjoy the kind of standard of living that would be expected for most proletarians in Britain. So you can get wages actually falling below the value of labor power. There can be the cheapening of the elements of constant capital. So new raw materials. I mean, just take one kind of historical example. Aluminium, when it was first used, for example, to make dinner plates, for example, were in the court of the French king. These were fantastically valuable and an extraordinary kind of thing to behold. Here was this metal that was so light and yet was just like silver. With the discovery of bauxite, it's now, which is one of the most common minerals in the world, aluminium is completely disposable, hardly even worth recycling from a commercial point of view. So you get the cheapening of elements of constant capital. Marx uses the term relative overpopulation. What he's referring to there is the development of the reserve army of labor, and the development of a reserve army of labor is crucial. By a reserve army of labor, I don't just simply mean lots of unemployed people. That is important, and that is mostly what's being talked about. But remember, these are unemployed people that are in a position to exert a downward force on the value of labor, on the wage. So, for example, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, whilst unemployment was 50% in Jarrow or even 70% in Jarrow, it was less than 5% in London. And lots of unemployed miners in Jarrow can't really exert a downward force on wages in London under those circumstances. Similarly, sections of the unemployed that are unemployable effectively exert no influence. So the important thing here is a reserve army of labour can actually be taken up. You know, these are workers who are in a position to compete in a race to the bottom for scarce jobs. So although he uses the term relative overpopulation, again, this is a reference really to classical political economy, in particular the works of Thomas Malthus. And what Marx is doing is pointing out the real nature of overpopulation is in fact this reserve army of labour, rather than the idea that we will also simply outbreed ourselves, as it were, and force down our wages into a level of utter misery. Foreign trade is important because new materials, new resources, new markets, a whole range of other things can help to maintain a rate of profit despite the effect of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And of course, the increase of stock capital. So joint stock companies, whilst they were by no means new in Marx's day, you can see how they've increased and how that continues to happen, where the number of people investing in shares in joint stock companies, whether directly or through pension schemes or a whole range of other, or just simply savings in banks that are then used to share it, to invest in shares and so on and so forth, end up increasing the stock of capital. So these are the kinds of tendencies. I want to say something else about this, though. Remember, Volume 3 of Capital was never prepared for publication, and Volume 3 of Capital was prepared by Friedrich Engels on the basis of the massively disorganized notes that Marx left behind. That doesn't mean to say Engels made a bad job of it, but that this was not a finished piece of work. Had Marx finished it, I mean, there was at one point plans for a whole volume of Capital on foreign trade alone. So you can see how this is an incomplete work, and on the basis of this, it's worth remembering that some of the objections that are raised to Marx's work fail to understand that this is an incomplete piece of work. So why does all this relate then to the foundation of the First International? Well, for a start, it's taking place at about the same time. Remember, this is the period after the reactions, that the clampdown, the Cologne communist trials, for example, after the revolutions of 1848-49, was a period of, ironically, of intense activity for Marx and Engels. The Communist League no longer existed. They closed it down because effectively the anti-socialist laws made it almost impossible to act as an open group, and that moreover, the overall reaction meant that the likelihood of the working class being able to act in any way, shape, or form was greatly diminished. So rather than just simply keep the Communist League going for the sake of it, it was effectively disbanded and Marx retreated to the library. Engels similarly worked on his magnificent Peasant War in Germany and writing copious amounts of works on his military subjects and so on. But throughout this time, it was also a hugely productive time from the point of view of the development of Marx's Capital, which would come to be published in 1867. And so at the same, what's happening? Sorry. My little mouse is a bit sensitive. But in 1863, there was a Polish uprising to try and break away from the Russian Empire. And moreover, at about the same time, there was an upswing in the working class struggle throughout Europe, a wave of strikes throughout Europe. So during this feverish period in which Marx is working upon capital, he's working upon precisely these ideas around the decline of capital, the decline and the origins of capitalist crisis. The International Working Men's Association was established. So in 1864, women were admitted from 1865, and this a unity of a wide range of different groups. Initially, it was initiated by British Owenites and trades unionists, but invited and brought together communists and anarchists and utopian socialists and trade union groups in St. Martin's Hall, which was a concert venue somewhere just on the corner near Covent Garden. And among its members were Giuseppe Garibaldi, Auguste Blanqui, and Mikhail Bakunin, more on him next time, and as well as Marx and Engels. And it decided its program and its policies by a series of congresses in places as diverse as Geneva, Lucerne, Brussels, and so on. At its height, had between 5 and 8 million members, affiliates. Why I wanted to draw the relationship between the tendency of the rate of profit to fall was that this was this intense period of work by Marx for the publication of Capital, but it also coincided, not accidentally, with the development of the First International and an upswing in revolutionary consciousness. So just to cite one example, often if people are thinking about where do you start when it comes to reading Capital, my feeling is just read Capital. But if you wanted a kind of easier way in, value, price, and profit is a common way of starting to read Capital. John Weston was a kind of Owenite, and he's advancing a series of arguments about is it worth engaging in struggle for higher wages, for example, because if you struggle for higher wages, won't that just simply put the price of things up and you'll be worse off than you were before? That's the substance of his argument. So basically he's putting forward a series of bourgeois arguments. It's not as if you don't see this today, the idea that somehow workers have to knuckle down and accept that the pay is going to fall. After all, Labour governments have brought in pay policies which have tried to keep workers' pay under control using the kind of spurious argument that somehow rising wages would only lead to more inflation and you'll be worse off anyway. And these are the kind of arguments that were being put by John Weston, who was a carpenter in the International Working Men's Association. Which brings me on to another point. Was the International Working Men's Association just simply a bunch of very well-educated people leading the working class? In part, yes. But also, what was crucial about it was that Marx was always very keen to have as much as possible ordinary workers taking part in political struggles. He formed, for example, later on, a good working relationship with Joseph Dietzkin, who was a tanner, and at every point, Marx was trying to involve ordinary workers in the struggle. And one of the reasons why he wrote, for example, Value, Price and Profit, was firstly to refute the bourgeois nonsense that was being put forward in the International Working Men's Association by John Weston. But he was also the crucial part was the education, the bringing a realization of the nature of exploitation was a central part of the work of the International Working Men's Association. So, and of course, famously, at the rules of the International Working Men's Association, famously the line is included, considering that the emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves. But the radicalism that we see in Marx's writings is rooted firmly in his understanding of political economy. In quote again from Marx, instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, they ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, the abolition of the wages system. The whole history of the discussion of capitalist crisis and capitalism's decline has a long history and has been taken up from a wide range of different perspectives. In classical political economy, Marx had drawn extensively upon the work of Jean-Charles Leonard de Sismondi, John Stuart Mill and David Ricardo have at the heart of their work an idea that capitalism might be up against a finite level of development where it can accumulate no more. Quite often, in the case of someone like Thomas Malthus, it was fairly easy to dismiss the idea that, for example, that if the working class reproduces and has more children, you'll end up coming up against the buffers, as it were, of the fertility of land. And if you have a poor law that helps the poor to survive, all you'll end up with is an impoverished working class, and eventually wages will be forced back down again. Well, this was clearly nonsense and took no account of the ability of the bourgeoisie to develop the social forces of, for example, land. Different criticisms are made by John Stuart Mill and Sismondi. It is Marx's critique of them that helped Marx develop a Marxist critique of capitalism and provide a mechanism for its decline and eventual demise. Not necessarily that it would be sort of replaced automatically by socialism, but that capitalism had to decline. Of course, there are bourgeois critics as well. Joseph Schumpeter, John Maynard Keynes, from another perspective, was obviously arguing that you could in some way manage capitalism in such a way as to prolong its life further and to take the rough edges off. By contrast, Rosa Luxemburg, Hendrik Grossman, Paul Matic, Ernest Mandel, in their own ways, have added to the discussion around the theory of capitalist crisis. The tendency is, when you turn on the 6 o'clock news and you hear about the latest drop in share prices, is that somehow this is part of just a simple natural circuit. This is just a kind of a tide of boom and bust. That's just a natural feature of capitalism. That's the way it goes. There's overproduction and it corrects itself, and companies go out of business and new ones are founded, and it's just seen as a cyclical arrangement. Well, you don't see that in Marx. Whilst there are undoubtedly business cycles and crises of overproduction are a real feature of the chaos of the capitalist market, that is not the basis of Marx's understanding of the decline of capitalism. Rosa Luxemburg, Grossman, Matic, and Mandel, how all have in their own ways, along with others, developed this much further. But what they all have in common with Marx is the need for the revolutionary transformation of society. And that is the logical consequence of, believe it or not, the distinction between surplus value and profit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, comrade. Excellent introduction. I think you brought it really down to a more understandable basis. So thank you very much. Just taking you up on your first sentence, I think one of your first sentences, which was quite good. If you don't, or if you dispute the labor theory of value, then you'll have to bring your whole Marxism down. Your whole Marxism falls apart. How would you, why do you see it so much at the center of Marx's whole set of ideas, that's the labor theory of value? How is it centered?
The alternative is in bourgeois economics, marginal utility theory. And what all of marginal utility theory has at its heart is the denial of the exploitation of human labor. Capital is just one of the factors of production: land, labor, capital, familiar to everybody who's done the most basic bourgeois economics: land, labor, and capital. And they're all regarded as having a kind of equal part to play. What Marx is saying is that, in fact, it's labor. Yes, land is important, nature is important, and it's an intrinsic part of all production, not just capitalist production. But it's the exploitation of human labor that gives rise to commodities. Commodities only have value because of that exploitation. It is only because of abstract labor, the exploitation of abstract labor, the commodities have value at all. And if you don't have a labor theory of value, then the basis for any kind of mechanism for that decline simply is absent, and it becomes then just a purely a reformist question. John Maynard Keynes knew whose side he was on, and the idea that one of the things I find interesting about that, the whole history of the Labour Party, after Keynes had published his work, it gave almost a theoretical basis to labourism and a whole reformist project. And if then it becomes just purely a technical question. The survival of capitalism becomes purely a matter of getting the sums right, and of what's the right amount of state intervention? What's the right amount of state planning? No, state planning, and not for the democratized planning that would be in place in a communist society. So from that point of view, it's if you don't have without the labor theory of value, all of Marxism falls to the ground. And the basis for the transition from capitalism to communism can't possibly exist, or is reduced to what we saw with utopian socialists of one sort or another, that it becomes purely then a moral question. What Marx was trying to point out was, yes, there is a moral issue, if you like, but that isn't the basis for capitalism's decline. And nor is it the basis for the need for revolution. The proletariat won't overthrow the ruling class just because capitalism is morally wrong. They will overthrow the ruling class ultimately because the very basis for capitalism's survival is undermined by capitalism itself. Not only does it bring the proletariat into being, but it can't help itself by replacing living labor with dead labor, and from that point of view, forcing down the rate of profit.
Thank you. What have you got against Keynes? He brought a lot of good things, didn't he, after the Second World War to the working class in Britain and Germany, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to see John Maynard Keynes and Max Weber as part of that whole movement of the time. I mean, John Maynard Keynes was present at the Versailles Treaty negotiations. Uh, Max Weber had a hand in writing the Constitution for Weimar Germany. And you see a similarity then. You see almost a parallel between the two of them. Max Weber, the sociologist, um, instead of seeing the fundamental division in society between capital and labor, it talks about class, status, and party, each one by implication having a kind of equal part to play. Just as John Maynard Keynes is looking for a way in which a reformist program can make capitalism last forever. Because again, the emphasis is taken away from the exploitation of labor as being central. And just as it is said that Max Weber was engaged in a dialogue with the ghost of Marx, arguably John Maynard Keynes was also. His whole point, the whole purpose of Keynes' work was really to the prolongation of capital and a managed capitalism that wouldn't, for example, bring about the horrors of not only of the First World War, but of course the tendency of revolution following on from that. And from the point of view of thinking about crisis and crisis theory and decline, there's a whole debate to be had around, is it, catastrophes like war that bring about revolution, or is it this slow, inexorable decline of capitalism, which ultimately, takes place almost in tectonic time, and like the shifting of tectonic plates after maybe millennia of not moving, then you see a sudden violent shift and a transformation. So Keynes provided if you like, a political economy for reformism, just in the same way that Max Weber provided an obfuscating understanding of class relations based upon the way you spend your money rather than the way you earn it.
A lot of people on the left still think, yeah, that may be so. He's not a revolutionary, Keynes, but look at what, Keynesian ideas, they help the working class, they got us in the NHS, etc. So it's not all bad. Do you think it's actually something that capitalism could repeat, even if it wanted at the moment? And why do you think it worked after the Second World War, but might not work now?
The USSR. I mean, the very existence. Well, arguably, the ruling class has known ever since the Paris Commune. I mean, even the revolutions of 1848 were a European-wide revolutionary wave. But certainly by the Paris Commune of 1871, the ruling class knew it could lose power. By 1917, it very nearly did. And measures had to be taken to make sure that didn't happen again. I mean, one of the things, there are some very positive things to be said about John Maynard Keynes. I mean, he was absolutely scathing in his criticisms of the Versailles Treaty because he could see that the destruction of the German economy had nothing to offer at all, and of course he was right. The awful conditions imposed by the Versailles Treaty on Germany arguably had a very important part to play in the rise of fascism. But so did Stalinism. And you see this kind of strange kind of mirror image in a way. On the one hand, in order to prevent the possibility of socialism, you need something. You need to be able to give some kind of concessions. Bismarck understood this even before the First World War and was prepared to concede, for example, on the one hand, suppressing the Social Democratic Party, on the other hand, conceding a system of social insurance. But after the First World War, after the Russian Revolution, it was imperative that there was an alternative to the possibility of socialism. And from that point of view, the Russian Revolution effectively made Keynesianism. It made Weberian sociology. It made social policy as opposed to social revolution as the imperative for the ruling class.
So you won't get Keynesian measures if you fight for Keynesian measures, because they're actually measures to stop revolution. So might as well go for revolution, because that's the only way we even get any kind of consolation prize from the capitalists. They will give you nothing unless you fight for much more.
The gloves are off. We're back to naked class struggle. We're back to the kind of naked class struggle that existed before the First World War. Why should they make concessions for what? People are not going to rally around the flag of Vladimir Putin or the People's Republic of China or whatever else. I mean, and from that point of view, even something like the People's Republic of China, so-called, is a bizarre kind of malformation, which is neither capitalist and absolutely not socialist. So, and you can't even describe it as some kind of workers' state or some such nonsense, because what part do workers play? You can argue that millions of workers have been lifted out of poverty, but that's purely by capitalism in a sense. It's the same. It's an analogous process, albeit by a different route, to what the Industrial Revolution had done in the Western Hemisphere, as it were.
So, I mean, capitalism, just logically, it has been born, and as you described so well, it is going towards this decline, but through its own, mechanism and through its own the way of operating. How then, I mean, how will it come about if the working class is not prepared? What about the subjective factor? I mean, do you think there's any chance of capitalism collapsing, or will it, but on its own, if it isn't pushed by a strong working class? Is that I know it's not the logic of Marx, but how are the two related, the objective and the subjective factors?
I think the decline of capitalism is inevitable, but its supersession by socialism, by communism, is far from inevitable, and it can only happen by the conscious overthrow of capitalist relations of production, and not just as the Workers' Party would have it, the way in which the surplus is distributed. That's Keynesianism superimposed onto a pseudo-socialist rhetoric. And even has a kind of red-brown tinge to it, because obviously at the heart of that has to be a powerful state to make it happen. And if you've got the state, it implies you've got class antagonisms in the first place. So how will it come about? It's only going to become about by the conscious overthrow and the conscious removal of the property of the bourgeoisie in favor of all of society. And it was interesting because the last time we were having this discussion about, and the question of the relationship between party and class cropped up, and somebody, one of our comrades had said, came up with this thoughtful kind of analogy by Trotsky about the relationship of party and class, as it were, as the proletariat is the steam, but without the cylinder and the piston and the rest of it, which arguably represents the party. That steam will be dissipated and so on. Whilst that's a good kind of analogy, it, like all analogies, it breaks down. And it breaks down in one sense because partly because it is a mechanical analogy, but also revolutions are difficult to make without a party, but a party is difficult to make without a revolutionary class. And if you at the moment have, as you have, an atomized working class, then parties that come into being at the moment tend to be sects. They tend to be groups. They tend to be, weird kind of anti-democratic bodies that are largely talking to themselves. And from that point of view, that dialectical relationship between party and class is the crucial question of the age, I would suggest.
Absolutely. And, our discussion forums are a way to try and overcome this impasse and try to help the reorganization of the working class in Britain and internationally, for sure. Thank you very much, comrade. If anybody's got any questions or contributions, please click raise hand and I'll make you into a panelist. We've got 2 people up with their hands up so far, so please come in if you want to get involved in the discussion. Ken first. Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, this sort of ties into your catastrophe, decline, or revolution argument. And my question was really, in the context of trade unions, did Marx, or indeed those who came after him, have much to say about trade unions as a force in either of those scenarios? Would he see them perhaps, or would they be seen as aspects of reformism, however they might begin? They ultimately become something which helps to shore up the system. And is there anything one can do to mitigate that? Is there an alternative to trade unionism, or do you simply is the wrong word, or do you have to reinvent the trade union every few years so that it doesn't simply become a self-perpetuating organization that serves the needs of those at the top? How do you get round, I think, the inevitable problem of trade unions becoming things that simply shore up the system as it stands? It's a very big question, but I'm sure you can think of an answer to it. So thank you again, Ian.
Thanks, Ken.
I mean, Marx and Engels were very much taken with the British trade union movement on both grounds, really. I mean, Engels had witnessed the sort of tail end of the Chartist movement, and had written for the Chartists magazine. And they were both hugely impressed by the Chartist movement. But of course, by 1848, Chartism was already beginning its decline. It was 1848 was a high watermark for Chartism. The founders of the First International were actually British trade unionists who were concerned, apart from anything else, with what happens if we go on strike and a load of French people come over to take our jobs or some such. And so the idea was to coordinate between different trade union groups across Europe to organize Europe-wide. Trade unions today are often little more than highly specific branches of human resource management. Most of them have very much cozy related. They certainly don't want strikes or disputes if they can avoid it, especially not anything where the decisions are taken out of the hands of the bureaucrats themselves, all of whom are paid much more than the people they represent. So from that point of view, we've seen a thorough integration of trade unions into bourgeois relations of production. And I don't think there's much of a choice but to use them. I mean, I wouldn't not be in a union. I've never not been in a union, notwithstanding the fact that they are often singularly dreadful. But we see it's at those crucial moments. The miners' strike is a glaring example when the possibility of a challenge is posed. In the case of the miners' strike, of course, you can debate endlessly whether the defeat was as much as anything to do with Scargill's Stalinism and the failure to go beyond the narrow confines of trade union mentality. But that's what we face. What we face is a trade union movement which is completely bankrupt and useless from the point of view of the transformation of society. But in the British case, has never been political. Of course, it was a little bit different in France and Germany, where there were political unions tied to political parties, whether it was the Communist Party or the Socialist Party or whatever. But even they too, of course, became incorporated. That doesn't, the short answer is we have no choice but to use them. How we use them, I think, as communists, is to not just demand ever more things, as it were, but constantly raise the possibility that the trade union should be talking about the abolition of the wages system, not just fighting over the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table.
And it's a shame, isn't it, that Unite in that sense has gone the apolitical way. The Unite leadership, a lot of people welcome that Sharon Graham doesn't want to get involved with the Labour Party issues, but I think we can see now what kind of problems that can also lead to. Also, I wanted to ask you about, I've seen this, I was looking at the Workers' Party program, and when they're talking about the trade unions, and workers' power, even, they're using Germany as a good system of what could be done in Britain to workers' control, which is the German shop steward system, which is you have a big company like Siemens or whatever, you have so many free shop stewards, not free, that's their job, they work as shop stewards. Again, they're on quite a good wage, and they're also getting very chummy with the company leadership. And there's been ever so often you've got scandals about, all the bosses and those shop stewards going to the brothel together, they're going on holiday together and stuff. That's not workers' control, is it? The German shop steward system is not much better than the British one, I fear. What do you think?
It worries me even more that it's that red-brown tinge. It's the corporatism. Among certain sections of the working class, General Francisco Franco had supporters, and one saw a kind of corporatist element to Francoist Spain. One saw a corporatist element in fascist Italy. The idea of you incorporate the trade unions and you make it part of the state bureaucracy. Hitler famously granted the workers the May Day bank holiday that they'd always been demanding, and then did away with the unions. But you ended up with Nazi unions of this, that, or the other, and ways of trying to incorporate it. And that is a feature which I think is a bit worrying about the Workers' Party of Britain.
Indeed. Matthew, please.
Yeah, I think there's lots in here. Obviously, I think the one person you missed out in terms of a discussion of which is opposite at the moment, of course, is Lenin and imperialism, which I think is extremely important. Obviously, the further discussion of the nature of imperialism, and obviously what we're seeing at the moment, which is the decline of American imperialism in particular, and that shift in those terms. I mean, the clear loss, effectively, of the war in Ukraine by American imperialism, and of course the position they're in terms of what's happening in Palestine. But I think it's you talk also of the nature of really the consciousness of the working class and the nature of trade unionism, and can it actually then get from that sort of basis towards a revolutionary consciousness, which again is something that's taken up by Lenin at some length. I think that there's also some more fundamental stuff. I mean, at the moment, what we have obviously is a system in which is actually now consciously directed by the ruling class. I mean, it's nonsense. I think the thing is nonsense about this is some kind of market system or whatever else. It's actually consciously directed by the ruling class. And what's happening at the moment, of course, is that the ruling class itself is increasingly concentrated into a very relatively small number of people, and it's sucking out as a society ever greater amounts of surplus. At the same time, obviously, the system itself is degenerate. That you get down to the point where you say, I think Michael Roberts' version of life, in terms of looking at the decline of the rate of profit, is too simplistic. He tends to simplify all of Marxism to one paragraph in volume 3 about the decline of the rate of profit. Actually, it's more fundamental than that. Actually, you could the real question I think you should be posing is what is actually a profit, and is what companies declare as profits, are they actually profits? Because clearly what relation do these things actually have to the extraction of surplus value? Because all of that's now quite difficult to work out. And as you can see, I mean, if you employ a decent accountant these days, you can declare a profit on almost anything. At least for a period. As we've seen on a serial basis. The thing is also is this shift by the ruling class away from production. Part of imperialist thing is to say, well, particularly obviously with the dissolution of the failure of the system that they put together with the Stalinists, the balance of the Cold War balance, post 45, of course, and the move to finance capital after from the early 70s onwards, is to change the nature of the system and towards away from actual production. Which is actually going to generate, is already generating huge crisis and will generate worse crises. In terms, I mean, it's very difficult to talk about crisis at the moment because it's actually getting to the depth. You think, well, it's insufficient work. The other thing, of course, one of the other features of it, of course, is also that the nature of production now relies, as you probably know yourself, in terms of having worked in a modern workplace, of course, is that the capitalists or the management are actually dependent on the workforce to run the production process. It's a matter of control of the actual production process. That particularly where you deal with any form of mental labour, and workers having to cooperate with each other, which is now, I mean, obviously increasingly the case. That in fact the control is devolved to the workers in large part because there's no other way of doing it. So it's actually sort of changing the nature of how capitalism works. And again, it then becomes this whole more ideological question. I mean, the thing that sticks out about capitalism, of course, is that it relies on different forms of compulsion in terms of control of the working class. Large part of it's ideological. It's less. In some part it's coercion, but large part of it is ideological, and the mystification of what's going on, and that's why it's been to a degree successful, of course, and why it was able to replace the more compulsion-based systems previously. And the other thing, of course, is that capitalism isn't very old. I mean, in human terms, capitalism is only about 300 years old. It's nothing. But whereas a capitalist would of course tell you, what they have is the eternal verity of everything and nothing will ever change, because of course is absolute lies. So I mean, in those terms, I mean, all those things sort of balanced on top of each other. Okay, thanks.
No, I don't have any disagreements with that. Just a couple of things. Firstly, about Lenin and imperialism. Of course, Lenin was fully aware of Marx's position, and in a sense, you can see it's intrinsic in when Marx is talking about countervailing tendencies against the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Imperialism is implied there. But of course it was never fully developed in volume 3 of Capital. So absolutely, imperialism is central to the heart of it. I don't know enough of Michael Roberts' work to say whether he's a kind of one-trick pony, but if he is, then he's not alone, because of course Paul Matic too kind of tended to have a over-reliance on the question of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Well, clearly there's a lot been going on since Marx wrote volume 3 of Capital. I mean, the very nature of money, for example, has been transformed. So when Marx was talking about fiat money, he was talking about banknotes as opposed to gold. But he was also, of course, aware of the nature of what banks did, and again, apart because of the grave theoretical error of dying before he could write everything, you know, that's something which needs to be developed. The problem is, of course, that many of the people who could have developed it were either slaughtered by Stalinism or fascism before they could get much further. So there's a whole range of debates to be had about whether, you know, there are long waves in terms of capitalist development and so on, and all these debates have to be had. But where and who's doing them? Why it's important is because if we look at Lenin and trade unions, Lenin was fully aware that trade unions are never going to develop the kind of consciousness that was necessary to overthrow capitalism, and that's why there needs to be a theory. That's why a party is necessary, if only to develop, but crucially to develop theory, crucially to have an education program which takes us beyond simply a fair day's work for a fair day's pay, and isn't it nasty that working class people die 10 years younger and so on. It again takes us beyond the moral critique, which was, you know, arguably Capital Volume 1 was part of that whole tradition that needs to be redeveloped within the reinvented within the left, of an understanding of the present. I mean, it always struck me as one of the things in Lenin's collected works is that big chunky volume on the development of capitalism in Russia was the thing that informed almost everything he did subsequently. He sat down and he took the trouble to learn the development of capitalism in Russia, and the amount of work that went into that was enormous, but formed the basis of everything he did subsequently. Yeah, I think that was ideology. We've had sessions on ideology before, but of course we don't really talk about what we mean by ideology. The principal ideology, of course, is commodity fetishism. The fact that it just seems a natural feature of this computer that it has value, and so on. But when does that break down? It breaks down in all sorts of funny ways, doesn't it? When quite clearly there isn't much of a relationship between prices and values. And again, you get a whole discussion around monopolies from that point of view, and other products where there's clearly no relationship between prices and values. The idea, for example, that a pharmaceutical industry can pretty much charge what they want because they have a guaranteed monopoly on producing it for 25 years. And above all, what I suppose is posed is the relationship between commodity production and human need, and particularly in the context of, you know, clearly capitalism can do nothing whatsoever about the climate crisis. Clearly, capitalism can do absolutely nothing about the constant tendency to war and all the people that it will take with it. And although I mean, it's an important question about whether the ultimate demise of capitalism will be about a great catastrophe, or whether it will be a slow, inexorable decline. It's a bit of both, and but above all, that conscious ideological struggle on the part of class-conscious workers.
Thank you, and thank you, Matthew. We've got a question in the chat, which is slightly related to it, which is, do any of the concepts that we've been discussing tonight, you know, constant variable capital, labor value, etc., do they play any role for a planned economy of the future, or is that are we throwing these concepts entirely out, and is it a totally different way of working?
It's an interesting one as to how fast you can move from capitalism to communism. As people are probably aware, Lenin talked in terms of a higher and a lower stage, as it were. And of course, you can see an element of that in the critique of the Gotha program in Marx, because he talks about this sort of kind of period when you would sort of take your labor certificate off to the common storehouse to draw what you needed and that kind of thing. So you certainly, in the context of Russia in 1917 through to 1920, attempts to just go hell for leather were the result of the circumstances of the time, and attempts to kind of force the issue with forced collectivization. These were obviously a complete disaster. From that point of view, the reversion to the new economic policy, the idea of a partial restitution of the market was, well, it was forced upon the Soviet Republic. I don't think we'll be in that position. We're not looking at a revolution in a country which had just decades before been feudal, even if it did take up 1/5 of the land surface of the world. A revolution in future will involve the majority of the planet. The majority of the planet are proletarians, and moreover, the forces of production have been developed considerably further. What is interesting, of course, is the way capitalism itself has to be planned, has to rely upon state intervention, has to rely upon the state support for research and development in order to make anything happen. And a good example of that was, of course, the COVID pandemic. Without massive state intervention, the development of vaccines so quickly would have been impossible. Yes, I'm sure private capital would have stumped up along the way and made a huge profit, as indeed it did. And we saw in COVID that there was a huge transfer of wealth to the already very wealthy during the pandemic. But the fact that capitalism isn't the sort of small heroic company in innovating and then doing it all through the market, it isn't, and it isn't anywhere. But what hasn't changed is that relationship between capital and labor, and attempts to suggest that somehow we see in the works of Paul Mason, for example, that somehow we will enter a post-capitalist world where, well, as far as I can see in Paul Mason's writings, the proletariat hardly exists at all. What all we'll have is an undifferentiated mass of people united through social media or something.
Thanks, Ian. I've got two more people with their hands up, Diana and then Anthony.
Yeah, the thing that troubles me about the trade unions, and in fact makes them ineffective, genuinely representing their members and interests of workers, is they're all plagued with hierarchies. All of trade unions and virtually all of the new existing political parties and new political parties coming up are plagued with hierarchies. And as long as you've got, particularly in the unions, what happens is that you might get members pushing for better pay or particular conditions, but the union bosses are appeasing the employers and the establishment. How on earth you cannot have an effective organization if it's got that kind of hierarchy. How do we get over that? The other thing that is that communist parties have hierarchies. Communism has no hierarchy. Real communism, hierarchy doesn't exist. And some of the communist parties are Stalinist. They might come up with some good things, but Stalin was, he might be more maligned than he deserves, but he certainly was, a control freak. You can't have that, and as long as we can't get rid of those hierarchies, we're stuffed, surely. I had a short patch in the Green Party, and that actually had quite a democratic structure, particularly with policy making. But even with that, the leaders found ways of getting around that and trying to overrule the members to appease the establishment. But that's just that small one point that I wanted to make about hierarchical structures. Oh no, there was another thing I was going to mention. Is the trade unions pushing interests of workers in the arms industry. In a way, perhaps that makes sense because they are workers, but the arms industry is not just murdering people, genociding people in Palestine, trashing people in Ukraine. We're told it's fighting against Russia. It's not. It's trashing Ukraine. They are using Ukraine to weaken Russia. We cannot support the arms industry. We cannot support people working in the arms industry. There's a contradiction there, so I don't know how you solve that one.
I agree with you. Hierarchy is not only obviously anti-democratic, but it's also extremely destructive. More hierarchical societies are worse for us, whether you look at health or anything else. Having said that, there's this kind of importance, I suppose, of leadership as well, which tends to imply hierarchy. The way around that usually is to refer to democracy. The interesting thing about the International Working Men's Association was it was very democratic. There was a whole list of congresses that it regularly had. The other thing that was important about it was that it had a properly worked out program that was drafted by Marx. And so there was a program around which one could unite. And of course, as we'll go on to see in the next session with the debates with the anarchists, whilst much of the debate was around questions of hierarchy and leadership on the face of it, at the heart of that lay something more fundamental, which was about the nature of the society and the tactics to be employed. So, so it's not for nothing that Marx spent his time trying to show that exploitation was an intrinsic feature of capitalism, rather than it just being workers being robbed. It was Proudhon that talked about all property as theft, not Marx. And so so it's not surprising that was the fracture line in the First International, and the idea that insurrection, as it were, as an intrinsic something intrinsically important, insurrection on its own could somehow transform society. The reason why it's worth looking at the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is to see that it's not just about insurrection. It's about the very nature of the way in which capitalism declines. Later on, we'll go on to see how in the period after 1871, France, for example, went through a kind of a boom period, which is kind of ironic, really, considering how close it came to revolution. But hierarchy and democracy are at the heart of it. I mean, the tendency has been on the part of Stalinists to caricature Lenin's "What is to be done" as being about a tightly organized band of professional revolutionaries who won't brook any kind of discussion. Well, it was never true. It was never true in the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party. It wasn't even true within the Bolsheviks. And what's often overlooked is that there were factions within the Bolshevik Party as well. And right up until 1921, again, that was a feature of the fact that the young Soviet Republic had its back to the wall. In retrospect, one can say that the banning of factions was an absolute disaster, because it didn't allow the possibility of any further development. And once Stalin had effectively taken power, then the fight was lost, really, unless revolution had broken out elsewhere. And as we saw, the Comintern did everything it could to prevent the possibility, for example, of revolution breaking out in France as a consequence of the Spanish Civil War. And the other thing that's kind of striking about many of the Trotskyist groups was that how Stalinoid they became. How you try having I've got quite friendly with people who are in what was Socialist Appeal, now the Revolutionary Communist Party. Got quite friendly with their cadres in Durham. There's a good slack handful of them, and they're very nice people, and they're very committed and very sincere. But they were as surprised as anybody else when the decision was taken to turn Socialist Appeal into the Revolutionary Communist Party. It was just something that was announced. The decision was taken by the hierarchy, and it was just passed down. And in the meantime, those poor sods who are out there selling newspapers and used as newspaper selling fodder and have very little to say on the party line, will be as disillusioned as many of the people I've known who's gone through the SWP or the WRP over the years. And these groups tend to take perfectly good cadres and destroy them over a period of time. You see lots of people who are quite damaged by the whole experience. And so, not surprisingly, any kind of notion around communism or communist parties appears to be an exercise in brutality. That's the last thing we need. I mean, communist party. I mean, when I was last time I was talking to the RCP comrades, they were saying, yes, but we don't want splits to happen. Well, if you don't want splits to happen, then you'll allow debate. Because otherwise, the only choice you've got is to split off, and you end up with the Popular Front of Judea sitting on his own.
Thanks, Diane. It's also, I should say that a democracy, it doesn't require a lack of democracy doesn't require hierarchies. You can also have a, which looks like a really democratic, and we're all the same, etc. And we don't have votes, etc., etc. That's supposed to be more democratic. And yet, of course, somebody's making decisions somewhere. It's just you don't know who, and you don't know how to challenge them. So I do think you're right to say that democracy, transparency, etc., is key to avoid hierarchies turning into, dictatorship of sorts. Anthony, please.
Are you mute?
Anthony, we can't hear you. Oh, I think your microphone doesn't work again. We've had that problem last time. Try and sort it out. We've got one more, which is Rob. If you want to come in, please, can you accept being made a panelist, or I could just allow you to talk if you rather just talk. Rob? You can speak now if you wish. Rob Gold? No? Okay, maybe your hand up was by mistake. Okay, sorry, we've got no other questions in the chat. Would you like to sum up something perhaps from the session, Ian? Something that, the most important things we could take away. Oh, hold on, there is Rob, sorry. And Carl's put his hand up now as well. So we've got a couple of more people. Hi, Rob.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Okay. I'd just like to say thanks, Ian, for that talk. And I think it's it's really good to hear you kind of putting the value relations at the heart of it, and that, you know, that kind of extraction of surplus labor and that fundamental exploitation at the heart of it, and, you know, drawing attention to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and the countervailing tendencies. It's really important, I think, for a lot of people on the left to hear that message, because it's that, I think a lot of people on the left believe that there's going to be a kind of slumber into, you know, we can kind of just walk into a transitional period. And what I really like that you've done is you've stressed on that, well, there needs to be a strong workers' movement behind that, in order for there to be any kind of transition. And there needs to be a degree of class consciousness. And that really, you know, brings me on to like kind of what I want to contribute. And that's, you know, when I started my forays into the left, I went onto Reddit, and I went into communism on Reddit. And I just started reading Capital, and I put a post on there about, you know, what are we going to do about class consciousness? You know, how can we raise class consciousness to a good standard? It immediately got the most upvotes on the Reddit page. I think about 324, which is big by their standards. And then I was immediately banned from ever commenting again on the Our Communist thread. So, and this is the most mainstream kind of platform for political discussion. So it shows you kind of, you know, even within the left, there's a lot of barriers to general raising of class consciousness that I think, you know, would be necessary for a transitional period. Well, what I would say is that, you know, although there is the decline in the rate of profit, and I would agree that there is the conclusion that that capitalism is in decline, I would say that, you know, over the 20th century, it's showing an overwhelming tendency to bounce back from periods of crisis by adapting its policy, by adapting social policy, and by, you know, reinvigorating or recommodifying, or, you know, commodifying certain aspects that hadn't been commodified before, and expanding that level of exploitation through various kind of methods. So, you know, while I agree that, you know, there is crisis, I don't necessarily think that that equates to eventual decline in the same way. I think that, you know, as the left, we can, you know, kind of jump onto crisis, and we can make a good, that our case is best made in times of capitalist crisis. I don't necessarily see that it's you know, that it will be a necessary end to capitalism, because they continually find ways to kind of reinvent itself. You know, I always think of like the 20th century as you can see it, you know, just kind of reinvigorating itself, and it gets a new life support machine that works better than it did before, and it carries on rumbling away. And then, so that's kind of my first point. I think my second point would be about, you know, kind of the impact of hegemony. Obviously, the 20th century is dominated by the kind of US imperialist hegemony, and I would just like to ask, you know, what do you think of, you know, particularly the rise of China? While China, you know, for all it's not a communist system, we all acknowledge that, what it has done is it's played on that labor relation, and it's taken control of productive forces in a way that other nations aren't. You know, that's really its strength, is it's taken over production from, you know, all corners of the world, and it is now the biggest producer of commodity in the world. You know, do you think that will have an impact in itself? That the kind of, you know, obviously geopolitically it has an impact, but do you think it has an impact to struggle in that sense? That's my kind of 2 points. Sorry, it's not very coherent. I'm not as sharp on this as I was 6 months ago, but I'm getting there.
Got a baby now, that's why. Thanks for joining us, Rob. Ian.
I mean, they're crucially important points, of course. I mean, I'm not an expert on China by any means, but I mean, there's some extraordinary features, aren't there, in terms of the role played by China in the developments in Africa, for example, and that's now a kind of a show that Russia is trying to get into as well, in terms of establishing relations and exerting its influence in Africa, for example, and that hasn't escaped the notice of the United States either. Hegemony is an interesting one. again, when does it break down? I mean, I think one of the the horror that we see on a daily basis in Palestine, I think, is of an impact of the order of the Vietnam War had in terms of galvanizing a whole generation into seeing what the nature of the system is. Even if it means that millions of people are indifferent, the fact that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, can see the very nature of US hegemony, see the very nature of Britain's role in bringing Israel into being in the first place, and of being more than complicit in genocide. I think there are these crucial moments where hegemony does break down, where it becomes increasingly transparent. And I think that the exploitative nature of capitalism becomes increasingly transparent. I mean, one of the features of the kind of, for the want of a better phrase, social democratic compromise after the Second World War was that it did obscure relations, that you could have this idea that workers could kind of take power, the sort of Benite state socialists that are still quite influential. I mean, is it Rise or whatever, that's Ben Sellers and his mates? I mean, these are basically Benite state socialists who just want the state to be able to kind of legislate socialism into being piecemeal. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because the Soviet Union isn't there anymore. There isn't the threat of communism in the way that there was, and from that point of view, they really don't give a damn. I mean, I'm not suggesting, for example, that I wanted what I was trying to get across, and probably didn't do very well, was to draw the distinction between crisis and decline. That you can have crises which can be resolved, and the resolution of that crisis can result in capitalism functioning at an even higher level. By contrast, decline is something happening anyway. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall, if you want a slightly macabre analogy, we were all of us, only alive insofar as we are dying. And the very nature of any organism coming into being, existing and dying away, is a feature of what the essence of that organism. And capitalism, in a sense, is only alive insofar as it is dying. And that tendency of the rate of profit to fall exerts its influence, even though you can see situations where it appears to be constantly thrown a lifeline, whether it's thrown a lifeline by the development of the forces of production within China, providing cheapened consumer goods for Western workers from China, or Brazil or India. I'm very happy with my Indian motorcycle, produced very much more cheaply than the same motorbike would have been produced in Britain 60 years before. And yes, capitalism does and can reinvent itself, but that doesn't mean to say that it's not still exerting an influence, and the influence is there to see, glaringly obvious, whether it's in genocide or whether it's in people in the United States living on the streets, and huge numbers of people who die for the want of basic medicines. And I don't think it's accidental, therefore, that you're actually starting to see those contradictions becoming expressed in the working class in the United States.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Rob. I think the question of China is probably something a bit bigger that we have to revisit in a special session, but it's an interesting one for sure. I mean, just a quick one on that one. I mean, it's very debatable how capitalist it is, for example, how if it can then challenge US hegemony. Having said that, of course, the question of banning TikTok, Chinese spies everywhere, and Taiwan, and that issue shows that. And the proxy war, you know, Russia-Ukraine war, that is a sign that the US is taking China very seriously, and how far China would actually be able to challenge really the capitalist hegemony of the world. That leadership role is I think another question that people like, I think Michael Roberts, for example, are very dubious about. You know, they think it doesn't have the capacity because it is quite a restrictive system. You know, it doesn't have trade unions, it doesn't have real sort of, you know, profit. It doesn't really exist in that sense because it's all state managed, he says. You know, I'm not an expert on that either, but it's definitely a question revisiting, I think, perhaps. Thanks, Rob. Carl, please, yeah. I don't know if your camera works. It does. There you go.
Just
Hi.
following on from Ian's very cheery reminder that we're all going to die soon. One of the evolutions of capitalism that he was just alluding to, the capitalists themselves see AI as a major vehicle for that. Obviously, our friends at Goldman Sachs have said that they're going to be able to autonomize 300 million jobs. It will raise global GDP by something like 10%. So they obviously see AI as being used as a vehicle to address, you know, the inherent contradictions in capitalism, like the tendency of rate of profit to fall. So do you think they're correct in seeing AI as a potential way to address that? And if so, how do we use AI from the left to counter that? Very quick.
Yeah, no, it's a superb example of exactly why that is worth studying, that tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Yes, AI will replace all of these people, just as the way that the spinning jenny had replaced all of those people, or the steam power had replaced all those people. But that's just the point. It exerts that influence, and it ultimately will lead to an even greater depression of the rate of profit. And quite apart from that, of course, you will end up. I mean, of course, the other side of it is, I'm sure you will get a growing reserve army of labour, which will provide a countervailing tendency to save capitalism in the short term. But it will continue to exert its influence. It's interesting, as you know, I returned to the National Health Service recently to pick up some shifts, and just about how everything is just sort of creaking along, and it's noticed by everyone. I mean, in every kind of area. Whether we can use AI, I'm pretty sure we can, in the sense that, you know, if you look at what we were able to do in the 1950s, what was there? There was the daily worker. What was the opportunities for spreading information around the globe in a way that we can do now? What will we be able to do with AI? I'd like to think we would embrace it, because they will, and rather than it just being a way in which I think there are lots of jobs that used to be thought of as good, solid, middle-class jobs that would never be under threat, which have been in my lifetime, and that will increase at a pace. And so, although we've got the proletariat has never been bigger, the fact that it will become a class for itself, I think it can only be helped by AI ultimately. I wish I knew more about it to be able to say it with any kind of authority, but watch this space.
Rob saying in the chat, they're going to gain consciousness and then join the proletariat. AI.
Absolutely.
Help us make revolution. I think that's a good plan. John has a question. I think he doesn't have a camera. John, you can speak now.
Yeah, hi,
Hi.
everybody. Thanks for such a interesting and thought-provoking introduction here, and all the various questions that have come up. I was interested in what Matthew pointed out or brought up. Mainly, he was talking, or seemed to be talking about that capitalism in itself is changing in as much as it controls the things in a way that it never did before, and consequently kind of undermines what you're explaining at the beginning about value theory and so on. Yeah, that's what I really wanted to say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the nature of the time that I've got, I mean, I just chose to focus on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. The debates around capitalist crisis and decline are enormous and really deserve to be dealt with by somebody who understands it better. But let's just take a couple of examples. One can talk about a crisis and a decline, perhaps by looking at a historical analogy. In the Roman Empire, arguably, the transition from the Roman Republic to the Empire was a feature. It's often thought of as being its pinnacle. You know, the Roman Empire reaches its peak under Claudius, arguably, but at the same time, the basis of its decline is already there. People who were once slaves eventually end up becoming serfs, and the conditions are created for a transition to feudalism. Similarly, there are crises. There are crises when, for example, rebellious Germanic tribes sack Rome, or crises where, for example, the development of malaria in the Italian peninsula leads to a greatly weakened population, which facilitates the sacking of Rome and so on. So you see accident and necessity in the development of decline. You know, you can have there's a necessary force taking place where, for example, in order to maintain the extraction of a surplus, you have to move away from slavery, chattel slavery, to something more akin to serfdom. Otherwise, you can't extract as much surplus as you need. So that's a necessary development. But you get also accidents in history, and in the context of the decline of the Roman Empire, the rise of other forces, whether it's German tribes or whether it's you know, uprisings in different parts of the empire, and or changing patterns in disease. But ultimately, what you end up with is a society which declines and eventually collapses, and it doesn't do it in a smooth way. You don't see the decline as a kind of smooth transition from one to the other. You see a sudden break, or a series of sudden breaks, and sometimes often not recognizing what direction is taking place. I would suggest something analogous is happening in capitalism, that it's increasingly difficult to extract enough of a surplus, or put differently, the way in which the surplus is extracted takes a different form. And so instead of reinvesting, for example, in industrial production, wherever and whenever possible, the ruling class salts the money away and doesn't reinvest it at all. And so, yes, it means the ruling class can have another yacht, but how many yachts can you use? And what ultimately does that do? The point I think Marx is making about competition, for example, is that without competition, the class ceases to be a class and ends up fragmenting. or you end up with so much of the social surplus being sucked out that nothing can be developed at all. And then you really are up against the barriers of the continued development of capitalism. So the way to think of crisis is different to decline. I think I would suggest that capitalism has been in decline since the beginning of the 20th century, if not before. And certainly that was the way Marx and Engels tended to see it. They tended to see it as possible, socialism as being possible at any point. That tendency of the rate of profit to decline exerts its influence, even if it appears to be going in the opposite direction. And of course, there are many other crises that are taking place, and it does need a fuller exposition, and certainly by somebody with more expertise in it than me.
You're doing a fine job, though, Ian. So you are our expert, and I think you've done a great job again today. If somebody wants to read up on this a bit more, as Ian said, reading Capital is not a bad thing to do. It is a bit of a tricky one, and usually people don't get past chapter 3. David Harvey is very good on YouTube. I think he does a good job in trying to break down issues, and if comrades want to delve into it a little bit more, David Harvey is a good one to go to, and his videos are on YouTube. Next week we've got another session of the Communist Culture Club. We've got Roger Silverman looking at Russian avant-garde, and we have a comrade from the US, Jackson Mann, talking about the origin of and role of mass public singing in the early industrial workers of the world. That should be interesting, with a few examples, etc. So thank you, Ian, and hope to see you there next week, comrades. Good night.
Right.